Thank you, Deborah. We're both so happy to be here tonight and discuss something that I think is at the heart of conversations during Hubweek and also at the heart of what Seth and I do in the studio. How do we approach the synthesis of art and science? And we see so many different approaches to this, especially today. And a lot of those approaches constitute sitting in one of the fields and kind of throwing a grappling hook over into the other one, right? And reeling its content over to yours, and then rendering that content in the style of your field, which ends up with something like sci art or glorified data visualization, which is very important and has its place, but we took a slightly different approach to this question. And we asked, what common question lies underneath or above both art and science, addressing these fields as kind of artificially distinct from one another. Maybe they're just different toolkits for approaching the same fundamental question. And that question, we suggest, is the question of the relationship of the human to the world, right? The question of human relationship to world. And the answer we pose to, what is the relationship of us to our world, we suggest it's a fundamentally constructive one or a creative one. And vision is one of the mechanisms by which we create that world or that world of experience. And so we've occupied the gap between these two different fields. We've said maybe between art and science lies a common question, and we can sit there in the middle of that gap and ask that question, and then reach out to both art and science for tools in investigating the creative nature of the human relationship to world. And I do that in neuroscience, and Seth does that in his work with articulated light, as we'll discuss. But it was in asking that question that we devised the syllabus for our class, Vision in Art and Neuroscience, which we'll also talk a little bit more about this evening. And we'll also share with you some of our approaches in our respective fields of science and art as to how we unpack the creative relationship to the world.
I would add the initial meeting that Sarah and I had. We were both probing vision from an angle of experience. As an artist, I, for years, had worked with light as a medium to sculpt the perception of space and time. And I saw a little video clip online coming from Brain and Cognitive Sciences department at MIT, and it featured what's known as an optical illusion. And I reached out to find out who was behind this video clip, because it signaled to me that there were people at Brain and Cog who were probing also on this experiential level how light and vision work and where the boundary is or is not between those two, between the brain and the world. And so Sarah and I got together and found that we, in fact, coming from very different places, shared a kind of passion and much of the same questions in our work. And that's how we began talking and working together, and out of that relationship came the course that we now teach. And it was an opening of this space between the art and science that really motivated us and still motivates us now in our work and our teaching.
So when we talk about the constructive nature of vision, which we keep coming back to in this work and teaching, what do we mean by this? And if we think a little bit about what happens when we're looking out at the world in front of us, there's light hitting a 2D array of cells, right, of photoreceptors on the back of the retina. And so the input to our visual system that begins the cascade of visual processing that results in this very rich world of experience is a 2D matrix of cells with some set of activations. And so the brain somehow takes us from a 2D image, right? A 2D activation map to this very rich world of experience. Now, if you can imagine, just as an infinite number of organizations of 3D objects could cast the same shadow, an infinite number of things in the world could, in theory, result in the same pattern of 2D activations on the back of the eye, right? And so when your brain is deciding what thing in the world created some particular pattern of activation on the retina, it's solving a problem, a computational problem in neuroscience at least, that's ill-defined. And what we mean by that is it could have potentially infinitely many solutions. But we experience quite reliably a consistent world, except in these cases, like Seth pointed out, that are maybe edge cases of perception. So illusions or other quite salient times when that vision starts to become malleable, or maybe when we perceive that constructive act of perception, that interpretation of fundamentally ambiguous input. But normally, the brain is just solving this problem for, what thing in the world resulted in this 2D pattern of activation on the retina, and then we experience the solution to that problem as a thing in the world, right? And so in our course, we unpack mechanisms in the hierarchy of visual processing that lend themselves to solving that inverse problem, or unpacking that constructive process, and we characterize it as creative or constructive, because in deciding which thing in the world caused some retinal image, the brain is creating our world of experience. And so we can look at computational architecture that could give rise to priors on which things in the world are more likely to be there and cause certain activation patterns. And then we can unpack a bit of that structure and look at how it plays out in art, and look to the creation of visual art as sort of an externalization of these world-creating mechanisms, and look there to see if we can find clues as to what types of computational architectures could give rise to our world of visual experience.
Shall we advance?
Yeah.
I think it's important to state what we mean by world creation. That's something that motivates both of us. As an artist, I work with light, and visually, without light, there is no world. I'm speaking from the standpoint of experience. So we take away all the light in this space, and we do not have a visual world. We may have memories. We may project certain ideas about the space that we're in, but in the moment of experience, we do not have a world without light. I introduce light into built or chosen architectural spaces, and as I do that, by working with light very carefully, I'm able to structure the way the space and the time of the environment is perceived. And so when I speak of world creation, I'm speaking of the immediate or direct experience of an unfolding space-time structure in perception. That's what I do in my artwork, as I will describe with some images in a few minutes. But the world creation in that point gets at the idea of the present of perception, whereby if one, as an artist, is able to sculpt space and time perception with light, there is, in fact, an experience of an unfolding world that comes, in this case, in performance, from my body. And so world creation in experience is just as it sounds. I mean, it's a visual world making that the technologies and the expertise behind the light work enable.
And maybe more in the neuroscience, we can think about this as creation of a world of experience at the interface between a processing system and some incoming data with some structure. So say you have incoming data from light hitting an object in the room, right? Light hitting that column. And there's some structured nature to it. And then there's some structure in processing system, in the visual processing hierarchy, that you can, in some cases, articulate. And then there's the result of that processing system acting on that structured data. And that result lies at the interface between our brains and the incoming data. And we claim, Seth and I both, from our own approaches, that at this interface lies our created world of experience. And if we can articulate the mechanisms, in some cases in the brain, in some cases phenomenologically, that give rise to that world of experience and have some understanding, some causal understanding of how processing or how artistic approach gives rise to a particular world of experience that one can create, then you can modulate that. You can modulate it as an artist, and you can modulate it in some cases as a scientist if you have an articulated computational understanding of that processing hierarchy, and you can use that to create very particular types of structured incoming data that will reliably evoke the same perceptual response. And so that's what we try and do in both of our lines of work, and then bring to the front of our course in terms of articulating those mechanisms and then externalizing them, having models for making, models for generating worlds that can be run over and over again and imbue the creator with great power, right, over experience and space, which is something at the core of the human as creator of their world of experience, but not something we often tap into. And so Seth does this explicitly in his work with articulated light, and so we have a series of images to share.
So in this work, what you're seeing is my body enveloped by the light effects that extend, in this case, from my arms and legs. What you see are fine white light circles in an otherwise totally dark space. As I move, you can imagine that the circles change in size, shape, and speed as my relationship with the architecture changes. You don't see a hard space. What you see is a fluid space that unfolds around the body. And the viewers are included within this space. So it's a very simple approach. There's nothing digital about it. It's pure analog. And I develop the instruments myself. As I say, they're just very carefully designed instruments with light sources, an optical system, and then battery power, and I control that myself in the performance. And the thing I want to emphasize here is that unlike our ordinary experience, where the light illuminates the space coming from outside, coming from the ceiling or coming from the sunlight, or in this case, the light comes from the body. And the light forms are highly specific, and they are driven by the body and the relationship, the changing relationship between my body and the architecture. And so we have, in a sense, a fluid architecture of light that is really a kind of illumination of subjective experience. So as an artist, where I come from in this work, light does not exist as an external medium that I'm manipulating like light effects. Light is coming from my body in a way to articulate space and time in perception, my own perception and the perception of viewers. And so there's an inversion that takes place. We could say that in a sense, these are vision performances. I am, in a sense, seeing the space in a collective way. I am using light to make that seeing process, or that seeing from the body, collective, and taking a subjective experience of body movement and making it public. And if all goes right, what you see here is that the space is sculpted around viewers, and there is an experience of movement that is shared by viewers. The space is moving around the bodies in the case of the audience. But nevertheless, there's an experience of movement that is transposed from my body to the bodies of the viewers. And that all takes place by way of light, which in my view as an artist is light and vision are can be inverted. And so I work with light in that way. It's a kind of externalized seeing process.
This next slide is going to feel like a bit of a jump because we're going to move to some intuitive physics work that I do. But to make that transition, one of the things Seth mentioned is the externalization of the seeing process, which is a theme that comes up again and again in our work, where if you can understand some process by which the brain renders or creates this world of experience, then you can externalize it, maybe engage others in it and sculpt space explicitly and with great agency and beauty. But it's this understanding that there is a process underlying that creation of the world that we can articulate with light, or we can articulate in some senses computationally with generative models and perception. And so some of the work that I do looks at the brain's understanding of physics or dynamics in the world. And we suggest that inside the brain, there's something like a physics engine, is one you'd see in computer graphics or video games, where, if I pick up this bottle of water and I set it down on the side of the table, I know just where to set it such that it doesn't fall over the edge. And I know the appropriate amount of force with which to grip it so I don't crush the bottle or let it slip through my fingers. And I can do all of this without thinking about it. And you probably wouldn't notice it either, except that I mention it now as I'm speaking to you. And so how does the brain do this? Well, we're suggesting that inside the brain is a model of the physics or dynamics of the world that simulates dynamics by taking in inputs of like static properties of objects like their mass or the coefficients of frictions of various materials, and then uses those as inputs to a physics engine or a model of the world. And so some of my work in brain and cognitive sciences here uses fMRI to search for neural representations of physical variables like mass and friction of objects that could serve as inputs to physics engines. And then I look at computational models of those physics engines and see if we have indeed substantiated that account of how physics happens in the brain. And so from subjects in fMRI watching videos like this one or this one, where an object slides down a ramp and collides with a small puck, I can decode from neural activity in regions we're suggesting form the basis of a physics engine in the brain, the mass of the objects in these various scenes in this example. And so in BCS, I look at neural correlates of generative models in the brain that render in simulation or in prediction in physics our world of experience, right? And enable us to act on objects and plan how we're going to act on things or make judgments such as, is that chair strong enough to support you? Or is that branch strong enough to support a child or a kitten? We can take this approach to looking at models underlying cognition in the mind, right? Because cognition is about more than pattern recognition. It requires models of the world. And so too does making and does vision, as Seth and I have been discussing. And we have this aversion almost to discussing those kind of models or procedures in the context of creativity, because we look at art, or there's this sort of modern malady of looking at art as this last vestige of human creativity and romanticizing it as this purely spontaneous thing, this outpouring of spontaneity that's the last vestige maybe of the truly human in an age of increasing automation. But if you speak to an artist, and as we heard from Seth, there's a lot of process and articulation of this world of experience underlying artistic work. And maybe it's during that process of making that artists feel most connected to their work. And if we can articulate those processes, you could, in some sense, tap into the truly human or the individual in some aspect of creating. And so in my artwork, I try and do this. I build models for making that represent, in some sense, the structure underlying individuals' creative processes, and then represent those models for making, sometimes in software and sometimes in hardware or in very, very fun analog ways. And so some recent projects have included just very, very simple generative procedures for rendering work in grids, where you can run one model over and over again and generate works that are each slightly different, but also speak to the same generative structure. And so looking at a single piece, you simultaneously experience uniqueness and the potential for iteration, which is a great non-duality that I think speaks to this concept of world generation, where every moment can be uniquely rendered, but it harkens back to this model of the world. Another simple model-based process for generating artworks we've been experimenting with recently in the studio has been with various machines for drawing. And so we recently received a robotic arm from a collaborator that we're working with in New York. But even before that, Seth and I and some others in the studio built a simple analog machine for drawing that was just a marker suspended from a servo motor that was rotating and then came into contact with various objects and would bounce off of them and would have this kind of waddling walk that was at once highly predictable and also kind of random because it would hit things and you wouldn't be able to predict where it was going. And it landed in this sweet spot of predictability, so almost understanding the model that was driving its motion, and idiosyncrasy, so the small differences in what it would create each time that you can see in these various iterations. As you probably also saw in the event flyer for tonight, this middle image here was created with the same drawing machine in the studio. And so let's see if I can come back and still advance slides from over there. Otherwise, I'm happy to hang out at the podium. So Seth, how do we incorporate this approach to understanding mechanisms for world creation into our class?
Well, the first thing I would mention is that the MIT Museum Studio does not sit in an academic department. It's right at the middle of the institute, and it works with departments, professors, students from across campus and across disciplines. So we bring together quite a diverse group of students, both undergraduate and graduate. And the interest is not to reduce art to neuroscience or neuroscience to art, but rather to keep open this space in the middle that we are describing, and to explore and to create from whatever is in between art and neuroscience. And to do that, we work, of course, with neuroscience models. For instance, early visual processing, as we understand it in neuroscience, plays a key part of the weekly lectures. But then, equally, we look at artworks that represent manifest early visual processing as artists have found them. Either historically or contemporary works. Could be painting, could be photography, could be working with light itself. And so we're challenging students to understand something of the science behind vision, but also to understand artistic method and, importantly, experience that comes right between. Experience is important to the science. It's where the science originates and touches back to. And experience is fundamental to the artistic process and to the experience of art. That is the viewer's experience of an artwork. So we try to hold it right at the middle and get students to understand both sides of it and then individually occupy the middle with regard to individual semester projects.
So I might pop up and advance the slides manually. But as Seth was speaking to, we take sort of a three-pronged approach in the class. Is it working now? Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so we take a three-pronged approach to exploring this interstitial zone, right, between art and neuroscience. So we look at current and canonical literature in vision neuroscience, and we look at creating artworks, right? So we work in hardware and with light in the studio, and then we look at direct human experience of these things and form a, hopefully, very valuable feedback loop there, where so much work in the lab does not study phenomenology or experience because it's very difficult, and that's one of the challenges that we've faced also, like how to quantify or how to capture subjective direct experience of light or of artwork. And so that's one of the things that we take to task with our students. So we have a brief tour through last semester's Vision in Art and Neuroscience course. This was the first time, last year was the first time that we taught the class at MIT. And we began with a Ganzfeld experience that that Seth guided us through, where students had their own mechanism, so a half ping pong ball for experiencing an equiluminant field of light, which takes away all depth cues and normal cues that we have to the nature of objects in the visual world and leaves the eyes with this truly ambiguous equiluminant field, right? And if you sit there in that state, and everybody can try this, just cut a ping pong ball in half. If you sit there with no normal clues to structure in the visual world, then you start to see your visual system hallucinate and impose its own structure. So it's a way to image a processing system, if you will. Seth will probably not like that language, but that's how I think about it. It's a way to see a system or see a model reveal itself, right? Give it some fundamentally ambiguous input, and then you'll see it hallucinate its structure as it tries to interpret that input. So we start students there, and we explore color with sodium light, and we take them through 6 modules that mirror the structure of visual processing and visual processing hierarchy, and within each module also build experiments that take ideas in papers further or allow students to modulate and experience concepts that they've been reading about in that part of the visual brain. And then, as Seth mentioned, students create semester-long projects that are ultimately exhibited at the end of the semester. So we're teaching the class again this fall, and we're at the point in the semester where students are starting to propose the projects that they'll do for exhibition in December. And those projects will range from analog work with light to programmable LEDs that capture human motion. And then in this project, a student named Ben inserted a virtual object into an equiluminant field of light and wanted to see if people could feel or touch a sphere just by light changing when a hand was in the 3D volume, named sphere, right, but had no other tactile feedback and just a visual one. Adam, who was also hoping to join us tonight, participated in the course last semester and is a colleague and a collaborator of Seth's and mine. And so he recorded a short message for us since he is traveling and can't be here that speaks to a little bit about his own work at the intersection of seeing and dreaming and how he saw that in relation to the class and to the work that Seth and I do more broadly.
Taking the class and walking into the class on the first day with Seth and Sarah was an introduction to a more radical notion that the way I was excited about a self-generated world in dreams had really tight parallels in waking life. That this is a self-generated world in much the same way. That there are fundamental rules to my vision and to my audition that create my world, that I am a world creator as much as a world experiencer. And it's not a new notion for me in neuroscience, but what was really new is the idea that you could have experiences, like something as simple as a Ganzfeld ping pong ball experience, and then you could start to see those rules. They talked a lot about perceiving perception, but how is it that we can reveal the fundamental building blocks of our experience to ourselves through these sorts of experiential experiments? And so the notion that waking life is a generated dream, the notion that you can sit between sort of logic and illogic, subjective and objective in your day-to-day experience, for me was a really tight tie. And I don't want to take too much time because I think the talk is going to be a lot of fun. But that sort of meeting ground, sleeping as a way of seeing yourself generating your world, yourself generating your visual world, your semantic world, using experimentation as a form of self-investigation of those initial fundamental rules, those fundamentally constructive experiences, and then coming to class and seeing you're doing it when you're awake too. And you have to mix art and science. You have to mix experience and experiment to really get at this intersection. Was super exciting for me. So yeah, I hope you have a lot of fun talking about seeing, internal and external. And I wish you all the best, and I'm sorry I can't be there. All right.
So I think what Adam touches upon is really the thrust of the course, and that is to say, becoming attuned to visual experience. I mean, we take it for granted. We just see. We don't think about seeing perhaps that much, or maybe we employ it in the business of art or a scientific study. But there's something to be gained, we feel, by mindfully going into visual experience in such a way that we, as the title of the exhibition and the thrust of the whole course describes, we can perceive our own perception. So nowadays we understand a lot about vision from the perspective of neuroscience. But there is, historically and today, a rich method and manifestation of perceiving perception that is to be found in visual art. And it seems to me that these two worlds have scarcely come together. And there is great promise in their coming together, shoulder to shoulder, which is to say the kind of intelligence, the visual intelligence that's embodied in art and science, the science of vision, complement each other in ways that I feel are necessary to understanding vision and therefore understanding light. And so what we're probing in this course and asking students to do is to become acutely aware of their own perception mindfully, which is to say informed by the neuroscience, but not limited by the neuroscience. And they create works, if we advance, they create works that stand both as artworks and works of experimental science, that in the sense that they are both informed by the neuroscience and pushing the limits of vision as we understand it. And so that's where the art and science come together in direct experience.
And also the experience in this exhibition was one, it's sort of a meta experience where you're experiencing yourself seeing, which is something that we've touched upon a number of times this evening. The works themselves, sure, they were works with light, but each artwork was the experience of a constructed world that the observer would have atop the piece. So experience became the object or the artwork, which made the exhibition very difficult to capture. And so it's kind of hard to see from these photographs. But in perceiving perception, we wanted to create works where the viewer would physically experience, and quite saliently, their visual systems doing this thing of world creation, which is something that we do all the time, as Adam mentioned, and as we've talked about tonight, but that we're not necessarily aware of. And it's a very strong and special thing when you encounter an artwork or an environment where you experience your visual system trying to structure it. You experience what our visual systems do all the time, but these artworks make you conscious of it. And that the experience of that became the artwork in this exhibition and will hopefully be similar when we do the exhibition again at the end of the course this fall. And I think that a common goal between Seth and myself, and one of my goals in neuroscience, is to articulate those structures that we experienced here well enough to be able to modulate them and well enough to be able to create experiences and installations that reliably evoke sensations of creation and beautiful sensations cross-modally that we may not have day to day. And I think that by understanding mechanisms and structure underlying created experience, we have great power to do that. And that's something that a coming together of art and science with tools in modern neuroscience and computation, we have the power to do now, and something I'm very excited to continue doing at this intersection.
I think, yes, that's our last slide. And maybe we can just leave it here. And maybe I'll start the conversation with you and the audience, and then audience can jump in. We have microphones there. So first of all, thank you very much. And it's interesting, as people who've been attending Catalyst know, that it's usually me, or it is me, that brings together the artist and the scientist. But in this case, it's great to see that what comes out of a conversation between art and science that you two have been engaged with for a while. So a little less lifting for me because you were already in conversation. And actually, just to tell the audience, we asked Adam to make that little hello video to us and to you because he couldn't participate. But I had started the initial conversation about this program with Adam, so I was glad he was able to say hello to us from afar. So, I just maybe want to pick up on what you were saying, Seth, about the kind of equivalence between vision and light and perception. And then feels to me that, and I know all artists in the room, or anyone who's tried to be engaged with that kind of process, is that you also are, the mirror, you're reflecting yourself, and it also leads to kind of, knowledge, or, that you know something by seeing. So that's just a comment. And I was also struck by, and it's something I think about, which is the lack of vision is, blindness. So it seems like all this work around vision would also lead some people like Professor Sinha to, because I know he does work on childhood blindness. So you can
it's
respond to any of that.
when we saw the image of the students with the ping pong ball Gansfeld experiences, when you put those ping pong balls over your eyes, as Sarah described, you have an equiluminant field. Mm-hmm. You cannot tell if it's very deep or shallow. There's no form, there are no objects. And the interesting thing I want to point to is that it takes about 2 minutes to experience that you don't know whether your eyes are open or closed. And it seems to not match what we would logically think about it. But it only takes that long before total lightness is total darkness, is total lightness. And that's a very interesting point to begin the class, as we do. Because, yeah, you're quite right, Deborah. That is, you don't have light without darkness, and you don't have darkness without light. Mm. We tend to think of it one way or the other, and we tend to think about, as I was alluding to, that the visual world exists, whether or not it's illuminated, and whether or not we're looking at it. And again, I'm speaking as an artist. I'm speaking about direct experience. From the standpoint of direct experience, it takes both, and that it's a negotiation between light and darkness, and we're very much involved in the process of visual construction, even though we feel passive about it. We have to remember that if we feel that we're passively receiving information, it's only because of our personal development, but also historical development about how people think about vision, as opposed to how we directly experience vision. And so these experiments in the course are ways to bring us back to a kind of immediacy of seeing, whereupon even light and dark are relative. Everything in vision is relative. And so if you go back to that starting point, it's a great fertile land of creative possibility, not only for art, but for science as well.
Anybody? Yeah.
Hey guys, thanks for a great presentation. So I have a question for you, which I'll try and put into the proper word order here. So your class is either between art and science or both art and science, and I'm not sure which one you would want to argue for, but that's kind of, I think either would be a decent description based on your presentation. My question for you is when your students make work and when you talk about experiences or experiments or work, but not necessarily science work or artwork, how do you assess something that your students make do you assess it scientifically or artistically or neither? Or are you coming up with a new rubric? I ask this not as a criticism at all, but as a super interested party. You know, how do we actually assess work that might not be either or might be both at the same time?
It's very hard, for one. I think that the answer to the first half of your question helps us with the second. And that first half was, you know, is this both art or science or in the middle of them? And I'd say that art and science, you know, as we touched upon before, I think they're artificial distinctions, right? They're just toolkits. And our class is about the constructive nature of the human relationship to world. It's about that thing. But we can't say we teach, you know, well, we do. We say we teach a class on that. And so we draw from art and science to answer or unpack that question. And that involves creating, in some sense, a new language and a new methodology around probing human experience, or something kind of called experimental phenomenology that people have been playing with for a bit of the 20th century. And it is quite hard. And I think the approach that Seth and I have taken to evaluating student work is to looking at each level of the process of engaging with that question. And so if students have identified some subpart of the constructive nature of vision that they wish to externalize, you know, have they well articulated that? And then when they've built some model for externalizing that, or some way of creating an experience, can they articulate, you know, how they got from that aspect of human vision that they wish to probe to some external model? How fluid that is a question of, you know, how well you can reliably generate some experience in the viewer. And so that sounds quite hard to subjectively, you know, give an A or a B to, but it is easier to guide students through doing that work, because it becomes quite obvious whether an experience is salient and transferable between students, for example. And so I'm curious how Seth will approach this question as well. But for me, it's been, have they articulated their question? And do they have a formulation of, you know, how do I render this part of experience creation in hardware, in software, with articulated light, in whatever medium I'm working with? And then from there, it's a process of, you know, working out the kinks and working with students to streamline that as best as possible and create something truly beautiful.
Can I just jump in? I was just thinking, so all you're describing is in the context of MIT, which is a school of science and engineering. And I was just wondering if you've thought about, or what would it be like if you had this course and did it in an art setting, you know, like at museum school or mass art or something like that. It might be.
I mean, I think the backgrounds of the students would be different.
Yeah.
If we're doing this right, then it would be the same anywhere,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because the inquiry is the same inquiry. You're just going to have to adapt to what students are coming in with. And so, for instance, this year we have a lot more students with a heavier computational background than we did last year. And so we'll probably see more works for exhibition that use that, right, to externalize structures underlying experience and perception.
Yes, it's been an intriguing evening. I have that impression that often happens to me wandering into a art and science talk, that the language sounds like English, but I'm having trouble translating, and possibly not the only one. So let me just say, and I don't really mean to hit you with this, but I haven't the slightest idea what you two are up to. I mean, I got some of it. But so you can pick up on any of this. For example, your light dance is wonderful to see, and I'd love to see a performance. But I take it that you're doing that to show something beyond the performance itself. I never got what that was. The whole point, of course, the brain creates the world that we see through perceptions. But what is this? What is an artist supposed to take from that, knowing that there's some, as you say, a physics engine in the brain that brings together the sensory visual experiences we have? Now you're sitting in front of your canvas. I mean, you're not thinking about what's going on in there. What do your students understand? Why what is knowing about neuroscience, how does that help them with the art they're creating? I think that's what she was asking a bit. I think if you were teaching this in a museum school, you would have to bring it way down and explain why should they know this. I mean, it's interesting to know in science how our brain works, but how does this help the artists do their art? Do they have new approaches that they work? You talk about modeling. I don't know, applied to what? I'm baffled. So if you want to just pick, I'm sorry, but if you want to pick up any of these things to explain a bit about the relevance of your work to the art world.
When I develop my equipment and perform my artwork, it is not aiming toward light effects in a space, like a light show, like at a disco or something. I begin in total darkness. And so the audience and I are in total darkness. The experience is one, as I've alluded to, of highly articulated light. For example, a sheet of light that's seen as a light line circumscription of this space, for example. If you do that well, optically, you do not have an auditorium that I am lighting through time. You have a slice of space-time, visual space-time. See, I'm not talking philosophy here. I'm talking experience. Okay, so when I begin with a slice of visual space-time, I then have the opportunity to move my body and contract, expand, twist that sheet of light that turns into an unfolding space-time. So we all experience that together. And what that means is that the visual experience of the auditorium transforms. The auditorium transforms. So this is real at the level of experience. Now, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I knew nothing about neuroscience. I still know nothing about neuroscience. But why does it matter to me? Because I find that what I'm up to for 30 years is actually a kind of empirical neuroscience of the artist. By working with direct visual experience and highly refined light effects that I push and realize myself, I'm able to unfold and manifest the visual brain in terms of how we perceive space and time. So because you're reducing it to dancing around an existing room with lights on my body. But I'm telling you that experientially, I am generating space and time in perception. That's not my fantasy. That is a collective experience. That's right, but we've all also reduced our fluid, dynamic, transforming visual experience of space and time into an objective, hard space-time, like this architecture or the world on Main Street. And so what I'm doing as an artist is I'm taking it back to the beginning of emergent light that's highly structured, originating from my body, and then I'm able to adjust the magnitudes, the speed, and the spaces that unfold as revealed by the light. That changes the nature of perception. So there is transforming material in front of you as I'm modulating the light. It doesn't seem logical, but perceptually, it's vivid and experientially real.
I think, sorry.
Can I say something to that question
and then
before we grab that
Rosamund
one?
will say something. Yeah, go ahead.
I love this set of questions, and I think that we should spend the whole evening on it, because it's what I worry most people think when they hear our stuff, or when we talk about our class to my department. And what I'll say is that for me personally, and I don't want to speak for Seth here, I don't look at this as creating a set of tools for artists. I don't look at this as how is the artist going to change when they now know what's happening in their brain? I don't care. I want artists to continue making art in the way that they are. And I think that the fact that that question in itself exists speaks to the fact that the predominant conception of these two fields is as disparate. And I think that is a problem. I think there is a new field that exists in the middle of them. And I think that by creating that field, we're staking out a mode of creating art that is distinct from the way that art is created today. I don't think that that's a new tool for artists creating in the way that artists are today creating to use. We're not creating that. We're making a new way of creating art that looks at the human brain as constructive of reality. And it looks at computational models underlying that constructive process as a way to render worlds of experience. This is something that people haven't done before because we haven't had an understanding of underlying structure in the brain that we can articulate and implement, in my case, in software. For example, learning from a training set of an artist's 400 or 500 drawings, learning a model of their creative process, and then implementing a model of their creative identity on a machine, and being able to create novel artworks that are visually indistinguishable from their creations in parallel to them. And so representing ourselves as creators and ourselves as artists, be that creation perceptual or visual in higher level art, representing that on other mediums besides the human physical medium, such that we can create in parallel with ourselves, such that we can create with aspects of our creative identities represented on machines and build ecosystems of creators that are not all human. That's what, for me, I'm trying to do. And I think that that is not a tool for current artists to start using. It is a whole space of work that requires a new language and a fundamental recharacterization of vision as constructive and an understanding of computation and intelligence that is not egocentric and human-centric, but recognizes the creative capacity of different processing architectures and their reliance on their embedding in the environment and what that does to priors and how we can run these models to render environments and fill the world with modulated beauty based on that understanding.
Rosamund.
Wow. What I was going to say is that as an artist, it's very important when to me, when a person is showing their work to a group, that the light in the room be correct, that the art be actually shown well on a screen. And one of the things that would have been easier for me to follow all of this is if Seth had had a really nice short film of the work and that the room itself that we were in, auditorium or whatever, had been darkened so that we could really have a secondhand but closer experience to what you actually do. That's what the problem for me was, is that there were several stills and the light around the screen is bright and the room is bright and we can't really try to participate in what you're doing. And that would have helped, I think, in terms of being from the art side. But I understand what you're talking about. It's just that it's conveying the art part.
Yeah,
totally agree. Deb.
Yeah, hi. I would just like to inject the word emotion and poetry into what you're saying, as well as a perceptual phenomena, because I think that is maybe missing from the conversation, at least when I'm looking at Seth's, when he's explained it to me, I'm also visualizing that I could have a deep meditative and, transcendental kind of experience in this room. So it's not just like this kind of mathematical or, the room is doing this and the room is doing that. What is happening is I am having a kind of poetic experience with what you're creating. So just like to, put that into the mix.
well, that's entirely valid and I think appropriate. I mean, when I perform my work, it is emotional, it's personal, it's sensual. It requires that. I mean, it takes place in silence, and it's purely coming out of my body. And so, yes, that is transposed to the environment and thereby to viewers. I think it's a good point.
And I think we have time for a couple more questions or comments? Go ahead. Yeah.
Two things. One is just an observation. I think in thinking about the half ping pong balls on the ice and creating a Ganzfeld, there is a very major artist that those of us who've been immersed in his work, that's what he does. He creates Ganzfelds, and that's James Turrell.
Yeah, I was gonna
and he is,
mention him, yeah.
I think, a wonderful model for the kinds of worlds that, Sarah, you're projecting into the future. And the kinds of environments that could be created. But Sarah, I have a question for you, which Adam's little snippet made me think about, and that was this business of world creation through dreams. And of course, the thing that is interesting about dreams is that there is no retinal processing going on with light from outside of our bodies. And so I wonder how much neuroscience knows about the process of dreaming, which is quite different from the process of seeing.
We know a little bit. It's different in some ways and similar qualitatively, as Adam speaks to. Just a brief nod to Turrell. Ben's piece for exhibition here was completely inspired by our visit to Mass MoCA to look at the Turrell exhibit there. He wanted to create a mini perturbable, experientiable, touchable Turrell, and that's what he tasked himself to do, and now he's blowing it up. We're going to try and make a room-sized one.
Right.
But I think that, yeah, I wish Adam were here to speak more to his work
That's
on
exactly
the
what he's-
neuroscience
yeah.
of dreaming, because that's what he's looking at now. Whether we can look at signals of people in their dreams and decode, what they might be experiencing, or modulate dreams by interacting with people right before they fall asleep. And he can reliably evoke particular dream experiences by catching people right before they fall asleep. Neuroscientists don't know a whole lot. There's been some work out of Jack Gallant's lab at Berkeley, I don't know if you've seen this, looking at decoding dream imagery, and so employing fMRI methods that I use to decode the massive objects, for instance, to decoding common visual imagery that the brain might render during dreams. Of course, I like to think of dreaming as a nod to a simulation engine-based account of certain types of perception, where you're seeing a flattening of what I'll call likelihoods in Bayesian statistics, or multiple possible interpretations of patterns and connections between an event that are all played out, where causal linkages are lowered in probability in day-to-day life, but when we dream, sort of all bets are off at interpreting causality, and so we get to see that engine run wild a little bit. I hope that in the coming years, that work in neuroscience will kind of we'll enter into a feedback loop with a more model-based approach to reinforcement learning and to machine learning right now, which will motivate looking at that time, that we spend asleep as another component of what we're doing while we're waking, which Adam also speaks to. I mean, one of the difficult challenges there, obviously, is that it's very difficult to know what's happening when we're dreaming with non-invasive imaging methods, right? Because you can't probe humans behaviorally during that time. You're using fMRI, or you're using these kinds of imaging methods, which are just honestly not good enough yet to really do what we need to do. But I think it's relatively underexplored, and so it's a great grounds for exploring some of these ideas more in depth.
So I think Blake has the microphone, and that will be our last question.
Great. Thank you very much for your talk this evening. I found it very interesting. And I was also very interested in what you were saying, Sarah, earlier about creative humans and machines working together, and sort of this idea of the machine processors generating several iterations of, say, works of art alongside the artist. And I wonder if you think within our lifetimes we will see those artificial creators spawn off on their own and generate compelling and meaningful artworks that don't have a human touch on them.
Absolutely. I think we already are. I think we're very close to that. I think we're seeing sort of hints of it and early experiments in it, and the world is not receiving it with the right language yet. Our legal infrastructure is not prepared in precedent for the legal status of works created by machines, right? We don't have serious case precedent for that. And we don't have the right language yet to describe those creators as intelligences and creators in and of themselves. And so I think some of the work that I'm doing is to sort of prepare the ecosystem for that kind of collaboration. And I think it's both incredibly realistic and a hugely beautiful and potentially collaborative thing.
So I think with that, we will end our evening, and I just want to thank you very much, and our audience as well, for a really interesting conversation that we could do again or more of. And I just want to share with you some Catalyst news. We've completed 5 podcasts for listening to Catalyst, which will be up on our website soon. And we've also produced 6 short videos, which right now are on Facebook, and we'll probably try to get them out other places, kind of the story of Catalyst. We're working on our next several programs, so check our website. And please, of course, consider donating to Catalyst, because we'd like to continue doing work like this. And thanks again to the Broad for hosting us, to Hubweek for partnering, and to all of you for coming. So thank you so much.